Welcome back. Now we're doing Chapter 5. But before addressing the material in Chapter 5, I'm going to ask you to read a fairly brief chapter from another textbook, Understanding English Grammar by Martha Cohn. It's called An Introduction to Transformational Grammar and is included as an appendix in her textbook. You can find a link to it in the Chapter 5 block on Course Connect. The reason I'm asking you to read it first is that our textbook already incorporates some of the principles of transformational grammar, without really saying so, and knowing a little bit more about it should help students understand what's going on in Chapter 5, because many of the concepts in it are based on the idea of transformations of basic sentences. The idea is that plain old indicative sentences, they make statements, are seen by grammarians as a kind of default sentence. Our textbook author refers to them as core sentences. When we make a question or command or produce a passive or negative sentence, we are transforming a core or indicative sentence to do so. Chapter 5 describes how we make these transformations for the various kinds of sentences, but you will notice that the branch diagrams are getting sometimes very complicated. I think there's an easier way of visualizing the analysis of these kinds of sentences. As you read Cole's introduction, Cohn's, I guess her name is, pay attention to the terms deep structure and surface structure, to the 8 rewriting rules, and to the concept of a terminal string. That's on page 429. The rules are extremely helpful in understanding how sentences go together, and you should be aware that these are not prescribed rules that we are taught to follow for correct writing. They are rules that we, as native speakers of English, automatically follow as part of the grammatical system that has evolved in English over hundreds of years. To illustrate the basic idea of transformations, look at the 2 versions of the spruce goose sentence at the bottom of page 425 of the handout. Howard Hughes built the spruce goose. The spruce goose was built by Howard Hughes. These sentences have the same deep structure. All right, so you can see that the diagram here kind of shows that this is its deep structure. This is a different kind of diagram that you don't need to concern yourself about right now. But, all right, so they have the same deep structure, they say exactly the same thing, but have a different surface structure. To produce a passive voice surface structure, we have performed a passive transformation, and that's this version. When we get to the part of Chapter 5 that deals with passive sentences, we find that we have to account for both a grammatical and a logical subject. With the spruce goose would be the grammatical subject. It's in the subject's place, but actually it's Howard Hughes who built the spruce goose. So when and the latter of which, the logical subject, also functions as the object of a preposition. So it gets very kind of complicated to do the diagram if you leave the sentence in that fashion. So my idea is that if you recognize that the sentence is passive, why not simply say so, then revert back to the original core sentence and diagram it that way? Here's how I will be doing it for the sentences that I'll be sending you, my corrected versions of the sentences, and also in the quizzes. If we have a sentence, the spruce goose was built by Howard Hughes, I simply make an announcement at the beginning that I recognize it as passive, so I'm doing a passive transformation back to active voice, and then I proceed with diagramming the sentence. The diagrams of questions, especially the WH questions, get even more complicated because you need to move words all around. But if you begin by recognizing the particular transformation, you can change the sentence back into its original form and diagram it that way. If you feel more comfortable with following how it is done in the book, then go ahead and stick with it. But I think many students will find this alternate way a bit easier. And it's not like you're cheating. You still need to know how all the constituents in the sentence go together. All right, moving on to the material for Chapter 5 then. Negative sentences. We negate sentences by adding the word not in the sentence. Not is placed after the first word of the main verb. For main verbs with no auxiliary words, or that are not be verbs, we add a form of the auxiliary verb do and make it the first word in the main verb. And this is pretty self-explanatory in the text. Then moving on to yes-no questions, I find it interesting how we use do to form questions with main verbs without auxiliaries, the same way we do with negative sentences. I'm not sure what the link is, but anyway, it's later in the chapter we learn that do is used in this way is an expletive. It has no meaning in the sentence, but is really just used to show tense. If you are doing branch diagrams and want to avoid doing that dipsy-doodle line that goes out to the fronted verb or auxiliary, you can simply start by announcing yes-no transformation and turn it back into its original form and diagram it that way. When our textbook author says, now moving on to the WH questions. When our textbook author says at the beginning of this section, WH question sentences query a content phrase, what he means by this is that there is information missing from the sentence. The way we make questions in English is to move the WH word representing the missing information to the front of the sentence, although you don't need to know those long capitalized names of the various kinds of WH words, just be able to know that they are WH words that are filling in for the missing information. You can use my method of stating the WH question transformations and then turning the sentence back to its original core sentence and diagram it that way, but you will need to supply a word for the missing information. Sometimes this isn't as easy as putting in a name, or you can often just plug in words like him or it or something. On page 106 there's a sentence. Let me just call that one up for you in just a minute. I guess I didn't have an image there. Okay, so the sentence on page 106 says, what had the UN officers discussed can be rendered, the UN officers discussed something, or discussed that. All right, let's move on to passive sentences. Over all the years I've been teaching this course, I'd say that the thing that most students have trouble mastering is recognizing and analyzing passive sentences correctly. To some extent, I get this. After all, it mixes up the elements we saw in perfect and progressive aspect, with a be auxiliary and a past participle. But I've never understood why they don't always eventually make this adjustment, especially when the prepositional phrase with by is present. It is relatively easy to test for a passive sentence, too, by flipping the two noun phrases to turn it back into a transitive, active voice sentence. Earlier, I used the passive to illustrate the transformation idea and to suggest reverting to the original core version of the sentence to analyze it. I should acknowledge here that my inspiration for this idea comes actually right from the textbook. There it says, the best way to clarify for yourself what the sentence constituents are and what their functions are is to put the constituents back into their core arrangement. I think it's true, but the thing is I don't get is why the book doesn't make the diagramming process simpler by following up on that idea.